everyone, and welcome to a very special Victober video. I hope you are all having a lovely day. And if this is your first time and you're happening on this, Victober is short for Victorian October, where we celebrate Victorian literature. So stuff published between 1837 and 1901 in the United Kingdom. And it's just such a fun time to celebrate this really remarkable kind of renaissance for the novel. And I'm really looking forward to speaking with Dr. Erin Van Laningham. So thank you, Erin, so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And if you could just give a brief background of yourself.
Sure. Well, I'm a professor of English at Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa, and I teach the long 19th century. So that means the Romantics and the Victorians, although my sweet spot or favorite spot is the British novel, the Victorian novel in particular. And I also work in the scholarship and exploration of vocation, which is discovering one's meaning and purpose in life. And I host a podcast called Callings, co-host a podcast called Callings. And I love to work with undergraduates on this overlap of how reading and sort of exploring narrative helps us live richer and more purposeful lives. So that's my sort of sweet spot. I went to a small undergraduate college in Iowa and did my graduate work in Boston and St. Louis, and now I'm back in the Midwest. So that's where I'm located, in the Driftless region on the Mississippi River. If anybody knows where that is. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for doing this. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you about several things. And so I guess if we could open it up, if you know kind of how you came to read Victorian literature for the first time, was it assigned to you, or kind of what was your introduction?
Yeah, so that's such a fun question to think about. My introduction to Victorian literature was in the third grade, when you had those library days that you got brought to the library to pick out a book. And I went to like the young adult section, and my teacher was like, I think you're ready for something more, and gave me The Unabridged Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. And I remember bringing it home, and my parents were like, are you sure you should? Like, that looks like a really big book. But that was my first introduction. And I mean, I always think of that when I teach Great Expectations now, because it's sort of been with me my whole life. Later, then I took a British novel class in college. I went to Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, and I had a great professor, Lisa Kildegard, there, who introduced me to sort of the blockbusters, of Victorian literature. But then really in graduate school, I got to study with Herb Sussman, and he introduced us to the blockbusters, but also like writing by the new women in the 1890s, and sort of, the underread novels, some of them like maybe Villette instead of Jane Eyre or something like that. And so I feel like I've had like 3 iterations of introductions to the Victorian novel, which I do think is sort of Victorian, right? Like it's this layering of experience, and that's the important thing. Then I ended up doing my dissertation work on Victorian women's writing about art, and so then that ended up being a lot of Victorian writers and novelists, alongside poetry and short stories. And yeah, so now I'm, able to sort of bring all of those different strains of experience into the classroom and scholarship. Yeah.
How cool. And now when you said your focus in your dissertation was on Victorian women writing about art, was it art that was featured in novels, or it was sort of nonfiction writing on art?
It was sort of all of that, but the chapters were like on the one chapter was on female artists, and one was on the representation of women models so like the character of the model, the artist model, was a really important character. I had a chapter, this was the chapter I used Middlemarch for, was on women in museums. Also Villette would be part of that. And then women as sort of like using art in the home, and sort of domestic representations of art. So it was like all of these different ways that there was a female aesthetic being developed in Victorian literature. I mean, we know that obviously the arts and crafts movement and the Rossettis and the Pre-Raphaelites, and there are lots of work on and representation of women in writing by men, but women were also writing a lot about art, and it was one of the professions that was sort of available other than a governess to be an artist. I mean, Anne Bronte's Tenant of Wildfell Hall, she the main character becomes an artist, right, to support her family. And so that was my initial sort of foray into art and Victorian literature. And I still think that that's an interesting way that women were sort of pushing back on sort of standard narratives of like, you could be a model, but actually you could also be an artist. You could also, sort of like go out into the public sphere and engage with art and ideas if you were in museums, that kind of thing.
That is so fascinating. So kind of, it was still respectable, maybe not respectable to be a model, but you could be respectable and interact with art in museums.
Yeah. And, and like Elizabeth Seidel, for example, is well documented. She was Dante Gabriel Rossetti's, wife and lover, but she actually wrote poetry herself. And, and then like, the representation of the artist's model just becomes like, sometimes you could be a model for yourself. Like in Jane Eyre, she draws, and Rochester becomes the model and things. So, I mean, it's fascinating. And Mill on the Floss, maybe people remember Maggie Tulliver is the model, an artist model in that.
Oh, yeah.
So there are, this was my interest, because it's actually very widespread. It was difficult to I mean, there was so many things I couldn't write about. Yeah.
Wow. So if I'm remembering correctly, there's a small publishing company called Victorian Secret Publishers, and I'm pretty sure they have released a collection of Elizabeth Sleidel's poetry.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Her stuff is available. I mean, there's just, with Broadview Press or things like this, a lot of these novels have become more mainstream since my initial research, but that was sort of my introduction and then my deep dive. And then, in teaching, you're just always sort of revisiting, what's resonating, what's interesting now, what's significant. And
Oh, so then from your reading that you've done and then interacting with students as you teach, have you found some common misconceptions you think about Victorian literature?
Yeah, I mean, always students are, you sort of bring in this giant stack of books, and I say to them at the beginning of the semester, well, you've signed up to read the best books, but they're all going, oh my gosh. And I mean, really, I think, for today's undergraduates, I mean, there's so much content everywhere. I mean, we live kind of in a Victorian like situation where it's just pressing down on us, but most of it is visual or digital and comes in spurts. But their misconceptions really are this notion of rigidity. It's going to be really dry, maybe irrelevant, and certainly unapproachable. I think that maybe is not a unique Victorian piece, but students, you're sort of saying, oh, we're gonna talk about a governess, or we're gonna look at this orphan who's living in the marshes, if in the case of Great Expectation, well, not an orphan, but like, sort of orphan-like Pip.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of pieces there, but then, so I think the unapproachable piece though, is that they're just thinking, these are giant worlds that we do not connect to. And there's this rigidity in Victorian culture that they're so stuffy or something. And I think their great surprise is then when we start reading and they're like, is this funny? It's like, yes, this is funny. Or, oh my gosh, like we feel so sorry for him because he feels so isolated with his family. And I'm thinking, yes, this is very approachable. And so maybe the exact things they're doing are not approachable, but the sort of emotional or narrative situation soon, once we sort of demystify some of that, it becomes more approachable. I would say that, the way that I kind of try to pick away at that is to really talk about institutions. So one of my opening lectures always with Victorian literature is like, okay, so what are the things that we're expecting here? We're like, well, they're going to talk about education. They're going to talk about school and the lack of school or the access to school or who gets to go to school. Okay, so that's something we talk a lot about in contemporary American society. Talk about marriage and relationships. Well, geez, seems to me like all of us, especially my, 18 to 22-year-olds, everyone's thinking about this, and contemporary society is thinking about this. And this is something, it's part of life. And there's so much of Victorian literature that's about work and about what do we do for work? What's purposeful work? What kinds of professions are available? What do you want to do? What are you good at? Those are all the things. So, and then of course, Victorian society is all about like the institutions. So building up, government and, the museum culture, art culture, all this stuff. And so that again is something that in technology, right? The Industrial Revolution. So all of that becomes very salient, very quick for students. And then they're thinking, oh, this isn't as unapproachable as I thought. And this isn't as rigid as I thought, because, oh my goodness, spoiler alert, Jane Eyre, there's a wife in the attic.
Yes.
Like what?
Yes. Yes.
Or it's also very tragic and horrible, sort of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Thomas Hardy. And I mean, that book wrecks students every time I teach it. And, there's just like, this is so unfair. And so that they realize this, that the stories have great impact on them if they kind of stick in it long enough. Yeah.
Yes. So are there certain books that are kind of consistently liked by students after the end of the class?
Yeah. I would say Tess is one, and meaning like they just can't, like they don't get over.
It lives rent free in their head.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know if like is the right word, or if there's just strong reactions, because I mean, sometimes there's like highly disliking, but they just won't stop talking. And so I'm thinking, well, I think you actually like it. Like, I mean, Wuthering Heights might fall in that camp. I mean, I regularly teach Wilkie Collins. And that's just long and hard sometimes. And, but they do sort of, like the challenge of the mystery and the detective novel. But, I mean, to a student, this is a question I asked them on their final exam, sort of which book is the most significant or influential and why, like what would be the book you would choose as, to argue for. And many do choose that, but they may also choose something like North and South by Mary, Gaskell or Elizabeth Gaskell. No, I'm thinking Mary Barton, her other book. Elizabeth Gaskell. They might choose one of those because they're like, wow, it's talking about, this really difficult stuff with trade unions, and it's really hard about like losing family money and sort of marrying across class lines, and its gender fluidity and things. And so, I would say it normally is a Hardy, maybe a Gaskell. And then I've had many argue for Middlemarch because of the sort of way that we read it. and they kind of live with it long enough that in the end it becomes the most important to them. And so then they kind of resonate. But yeah.
So then what is it for you personally that about Victorian literature that just keeps it fresh and you just want to, because these are all books that were published a long time ago, right? There's nothing new that's going to come out. What is it about it?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting because every time I go to teach this, I think, wow, how many times have I read it? And I haven't actually counted, So like, why do I keep assigning this? Like I could assign something else. But I do love the granular detail. I mean, it's the thing that's sort of frustrating about Victorian novels, but it's also the thing that is just so all encompassing, right? Like just the description of the rooms and the streets and the fog and, all of those pieces and like all of the various landscapes. So that like that granular detail I love.
Yes.
It's also the scope. Like it just feels like you're not even in a book like Wuthering Heights, which really don't go anywhere besides these two places, right? It's not Dickens, which is completely panoramic, but the scope just seems, so vast that it's historical and it's, sort of physical, you're sort of exploring London, with Pip and you can go around everywhere and then you can go back home with him. And so there are those pieces that I love. So there's this micro, macro piece. I think that, there are this sense though, that the characters are the thing that there's just so memorable, that you're thinking, oh, gosh, isn't that great when that happens? Like, I just can't wait for certain people to like come on the scene. And you realize that the Victorian novel just creates these communities and worlds, and you just watch people, inhabit them, and you get to be there with them. And, for me, that's just something that's, really just, it constantly brings you back. And depending on maybe where you are in your own life or in your own evolution of maturity, you're realizing that that's something that's just relevant and also just sort of a tug to you either intellectually or emotionally, that keeps you in it. There's also just such a variety of Victorian literature. In the British novel, it's just fun because we can do the industrial novel. We can do the Bildungsroman. We can, do a novel like Tess that you just know is going to have this tragic element in it. Novel of community, so, and even the novella, like something by Oscar Wilde or Joseph Conrad or something. So there's room in it for variety, that I think also, pulls me back. But yeah, those are some of the things that I would say the Victorian period, but the novel in particular, brings me to.
I love speaking with a whole variety of people because you've given me so many things that I wouldn't have necessarily thought about. Oh yes, that's an aspect of Victorian literature that I love, but it is. And these characters that you really come to care for are some that are written so well that you love to hate them. And I love in George Eliot's Romola, dreadful character, and I won't give it away if people haven't read it, but I loved in her journals she actually wrote, killed off so and so in great excitement.
yeah And I just love it because like Miss Havisham in Great Expectations, or Jaggers, you're just like, yeah, like look at what they're doing. And it's really fun to kind of pull that forward for students to say like, this is kind of ridiculous.
Yes.
And it's also like so real because we all know sort of the crazy aunt person, right? Or whatever it is. And we all know like the villain that is, Alec in Tess.
Yes.
And
Or also the like failure to launch young man like Fred Vinci.
Right? Where, I mean, that's why Middlemarch is just so incredible, because you're like, okay, like who doesn't know any of these people? Like we all know all these people. And so we're able to sort of point at them and say, yeah, I mean, you may get a little bored with him, but like, isn't that like the Thanksgiving table at your house? Like, and so that's where I try to always kind of say, the Victorian novel, it's realism. I mean, it's got, it's squarely in realism. So, what is reality here? Like, I mean, that's where Gaskell is great, because it's just deep on that. Yeah.
Yes. So then this is going to be like asking you to choose your favorite child, but some of the first novels that come to mind when I ask you, some of your favorites as of today, right now, some of your favorites, if you had to.
Yeah. I mean, I would say Jane Eyre almost all the time, just because it has like lots of different parts of it. I mean, it's flawed in beautiful ways. And, but I just, sort of kind of getting to live with Jane and kind of ask all the questions. I do go to that novel a lot. I love Bleak House by Dickens. It's just such a rich and, the multiple narratives in it, that we follow they're each compelling. So, I mean, I love that book. And I mean, I will say Middlemarch, but I know we're going to talk about that later. And, Mill on the Floss was one of the few books that I, was just sort of sobbing at the end and threw it across the room. And I have a hard time even teaching that book. I mean, so I typically don't teach it because I do Middlemarch instead for Eliot, but I would say Mill on the Floss is one of my favorites because it affects you so deeply. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Mill on the Floss is a struggle for me. I have come back to it. I came back to it a second time and I appreciated more, but it hasn't quite won my heart over yet. I think I'm so fond of Maggie, and it's so frustrating.
It's so frustrating. And and so don't read that back to back with Tess, because it's just too much. But those would be some of them. I think like I've taught Great Expectations a whole bunch and I love it. And, some books are fun because, there's a whole subgenre, of course, of like, responses to Victorian literature. And sometimes I teach a book called Mr. Pip by Lloyd Jones, who's a great, and so I bookend my class with like, we start with Great Expectations, we end with Mr. Pip. And so sometimes I just like Mr. Great Expectations because then I get to talk about it again through Mr. Pip. And so there's, I guess, but today I'll go with Jane Eyre and Bleak House. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. It's so funny. I feel so basic, as they say, picking Jane Eyre as well, but there's just something about it. And it is, I mean, it's the character of Jane. And she's just like, here, we're going to sit. I'm going to tell you about my life.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I don't know. Yeah. And in some ways, as some people joke in the field, like, oh, if you like Villette, you're more, more involved. And I mean, Villette is great. It's such a different book, but probably if I'm going to just reread, I'm going to go to Jane Eyre.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, I guess we could segue now into Middlemarch and some of the research that you've done on it and how you think reading can help people navigate finding meaning in your life. And before we launch into it, though, I just want to show you that I have on my Kindle case the quote, "What do we live for if it is not meant to make life less difficult for each other?" And and then the ending statement of Middlemarch, the ending paragraph that I think is so beautiful and meaningful, says, "Her finely touched spirit had still its fine issues, though they were not widely visible. Her full nature, like that river of which Cyrus broke the strength, spent itself in channels which had no great name on the earth. But the effect of her being on those around her was incalculably diffusive. for the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs.
Yes, so beautiful. Mm-hmm.
It is. It's so touching. So, did you volunteer to read Middlemarch for the first time, or was it assigned to you?
No, it was definitely assigned to me in my undergraduate British novel class. And again, I had a really great teacher for that. And, I remember when I was reading it as an undergraduate, I mean, it's just a tome. And it is, and I mean, the great thing about Marianne Evans, George Eliot, right, is like she writes in an intellectual, philosophical vein about, real life. And so you have a headiness and sort of 2 feet on the ground at the same time. But I remember reading and thinking, I think I'm getting only about a quarter of this. Like,
same.
Like there's just a lot going on, and you're aware that you may be understanding it, but you don't know the full impact of it. And so that was my first encounter with Middlemarch. And then, later in graduate school, sort of reread it, used it as part of my dissertation. And then, the first time I tried to teach it, it was like, oh my gosh, this is like so hard to teach it, because it's such a perfect book in so many ways, but it's also just like that unapproachability it's real, it's palpable. It's just like, who are all these people, and what are the, it's written in the 1870s, it's set in the 30s, and you're just trying to like navigate all sorts of like political and economic issues that she's talking about. We're talking about provincial life. I teach, I teach students who are grew up in an urban environment in Chicago, but also many in small towns in the Midwest. So sometimes students understand what provincial life means, and some don't. So we often have to draw that forward. So my initial, coming to Middlemarch and then sort of, revisiting it throughout my career, you kind of see the book, in a different sort of light, depending on where you've been at. And I mean, that's where Rebecca Mead's My Life in Middlemarch it's such a great memoir, but also her initial essay in the New Yorker resonated with so many people because she just was saying, I came to it at 3 different times in my life, and now I understand it. And I'm saying that's how many books are, but certainly Victorian literature. So when I started to teach the book, kind of more along the lines, I mean, I can't do it because I have a semester. We have 15 weeks, not 52 weeks or, like a whole year. I mean, the novel was initially 8 installments, but once I started to spread it out over the semester, students just started to do so much better with it.
Wow.
And I realized, so I kind of call it like, we're sort of simulating the Victorian way of reading. And it is that sort of slowing down with the book that helped. And it also helped me be able to teach to what I think the book does best, which is maybe sort of teach us about adulting, but teach us about vocational discernment and sort of where are you going in life? What is the work that is calling you? What are the roles that sort of you're going to want to be taking on? And how do you figure that out? And that's the stuff students really latch onto when you have enough time to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's I really appreciate, there really is such a range of people having things together to really not having things together. And I think the kind of the ultimate, you're like, I don't want to be like this, is Casaubon. So you're having this big long-term game, but you have no idea. He's crippled with not knowing kind of how to
He's just in the maze of his mind, the catacombs of his mind, or whatever. And and then at the same time, we don't want to be like Dorothea, and we don't want to be like Rosamund, or you're like, or Lydgate, or you're like, oh my gosh, like, wait, which one am I? And
I think we want to be like Mary Garth. I think that's what we want to be like.
Exactly. So everybody all of a sudden realizes, oh, Mary, she's the one. But what's interesting is that Mary has less choices, because she has to, either be a governess, or she's taking care, right, of the uncle. Like she doesn't have the sort of freedom to not work and things initially. And so she's actually, and then, Rosamund initially has like the ability to marry who she would like, right? Yes. Dorothea has she has a fortune of her own, right? And so she has even more freedom. And you kind of realize like, oh, okay, like Fred has more choices than Rosamund because he's been sent to university, but that he doesn't want to do that. No. So it is, you don't want to be like Cassian, but you're also like, oh my gosh, in the first book of Middlemarch, wow, Dorothea already made that choice. It's not a total spoiler because it's in the first bit of the book, but I say to students, most Victorian novels, like the whole thing is about who are you going to marry? And in Middlemarch, it's already done in like the first part. So now we got to walk through the marriage. Yes. And that's the thing Eliot gives us, is sort of this real granular, totally fair assessment of what marriage looks like, and the real contours of it. And that's an adulting. That's the piece where the book kind of prompts reflection in readers, like, oh, maybe should have thought a little bit more clearly about that choice, but also how would she have done it? Because no one's talking. Well, people had warned her about Casamund, but her idea of what she was going to be able to do is very different. Yeah.
Yeah, very different and very naive. It's funny because she is very philosophical in theory, right, but it's a very kind of emotional decision that she makes.
Yeah. And she also thinks Casamund is a different person. She thinks she's going to be sort of a partner in dialogue and intellectual work, but she is not, that's not how he understands it. And there are some parts in Middlemarch, where the narrator is sympathetic to Casaubon, because it's like, well, why would he think that that his wife is supposed to be this intellectual partner? Like there's not a lot that's been prepared. So there are always times where I try to push back on students, because we all don't like Casamund, but at the same time, I'm like, is it realistic for us to expect him to be different? And so there, you've got to kind of think about that in terms of like, why do we want him to like evolve up so much? Yes. And so those are all really important bits of that teaching. But I think that the book is so good with undergraduates today, especially if you read it slowly, because there are 6, maybe if we want to count Celia and Sir James, like 8 different, couples and people that we can follow throughout all of these decisions, not only about marriage, but about work, and about then how to make all of these things work to be meaningful. And everybody is struggling with that. Everyone in the book, like Lydgate, again, total fatal. He and Dorothea are parallel, right? Because he makes it a choice of marriage without understanding that Rosamund doesn't value his, like, why he loves medicine.
Yes. And it's a very spontaneous decision. It's like, maybe he had been contemplating it, but then all of a sudden, she's crying in his arms and he's like, hey, why don't you marry me?
Exactly. And so, the thing is that, it allows, I mean, what Eliot does is so it's not just all on Dorothea, like we relive it through, Lydgate and Rosamund or whatever. Um, and you start to see that this is like there are consequences for choices. It's not an ending. But it is another next step. So what are the next steps of how we're going to transform? We're going to reflect. We're going to sort of come together in community. There are all these other moments, which is one thing I love about the novel, where you realize that everyone is sort of isolated, but once they stop being so isolated, so Dorothea and Rosamund realize they can kind of help each other in some way. And then Lydgate and Dorothea kind of come together. There are different ways. And then, and Ladislaus, of course, involved in this. And so you're just like, oh, this is how people can, sort of help each other in community. And that's a really important part of the book. It's a study of provincial life. It's not just a study. It's not named Dorothea. The book is about Middlemarch. It's a community. And so what is Eliot kind of saying, and I do think this is sort of vocational, or how we discover meaning, is like, we just can't go it alone. Dorothea is miserable in Rome. She's miserable by herself. And so that's another thing I think the book, and I mean, like Fred Vincy, is like just flailing around all the time until the guards are like, okay, we got to help you. But, again, once he gets a mentor in Mr. Garth, then we start to see, and, Fairbrother. So there's just a lot of pieces of the adulting piece that help in conversation about meaningful lives.
Yeah. I feel like a major element of Eliot's novels is the plot is the refining of one's character. Which makes me think also of fairy tales, kind of the slaying the dragon. That's these characters, they're slaying the everyday mundane dragons in their lives.
Yeah, well, I mean, the opening prologue to Middlemarch, right? It's Saint Teresa. And so that's not a fairy tale, but there is this sort of nod to the epic, nod to national tales. And there's this sort of ugly duckling moment where, like, you kind of realize, like, we're going to focus on the ugly duckling in the prologue to the book, the opening. And so you mentioning fairy tales, I mean, it's not the same, but there are the idea that this isn't an epic or a national tale, but it has that kind of ability to sort of be that. And that links to the end part that you brought up, or you read at the start of this, which is this notion of the unhistoric. And I mean, my argument would be that, Eliot shows us these very deep stories of everyday life, of the unhistoric, even though, Lydgate wants to be a famous doctor. And, Dorothea has these grand plans to be the next Saint Teresa and all this stuff. But, it is the unhistoric that matters. It is the moment where Dorothea and Rosamund sort of come to an understanding that makes the world better between you and me. And that, to me, is a really significant part of how reading literature can help us sort of step back and think, okay, like, is that what I'm kind of called to do in my life, not just out of like, sort of a limiting, value structure or something, or just, but I mean, really, like, sort of what is the effect that I want this narrative to have on me, and the way that I'm sort of making choices, whether they're impulsive or emotional or, out of deep reflection. How can then that help me sort of connect with others? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because the reform bill being a part of the plot, which is it's my least favorite sections.
Oh yeah.
In the book. But that is a way that that people can try to make a difference in the world. And, Will Ladislaw is thinking about doing that. And then I love, actually, it's in Daniel Deronda. Someone suggested Daniel, well, what do you think about getting into politics? And he says, I don't want to have opinions for a living.
Right. And I mean, the reform bill part is a hard part to teach. But I think like also you sort of see Mr. Brooke trying to, he's got tomatoes thrown at him and he's just totally like, Will Laslaw's like managing his campaign. Again, I find this like very relevant to contemporary society. And I'm also sort of saying like, hey, this is what happens when people are out of touch with each other. Like Mr. Brooke doesn't understand what is going, like he was unprepared for that. And so yeah, I mean it's a way to talk about public life. And I mean, in the end, that becomes a piece of the story for Legate and Dorothea and Ladislaw, because all of their work is aimed towards the public. It's not just their own comfy life. And, I think sometimes, Eliot's books, there's been research on this, and I do talk about it in some of my scholarship on Middlemarch. But I think that like the community aspect, I mean, Eliot's interested in the representation of community and how we're engaging with that, whether it's through politics or not. Sometimes it's not as developed as her individual kind of characters and things, but so community can kind of be idealized or something. But there are these moments where she shows community and all of its sort of warts and all. And I think, yeah, that's what it's like to live in a small town. Like poor old Lydgate, he's like in between the small town argument, and he walks right into that.
And he gets canceled.
He totally, so it's just like, that's important. Fairbrother is like the best character. But he has to kind of be reconciled that he's not the best preacher, because he doesn't totally believe in all the things, but he's the best person. Yeah. And everyone knows that. And so, I sort of think that like when we look at it holistically, it's what try to draw out with students, like, and then there are lots of sacrifices people make for each other, like in it. And there are also dangerous decisions that people make that almost like kind of ruin each other's lives. And you're like, don't do that, because think about the ramifications to everyone else. So there, Middlemarch offers us lots of things to talk about in that way. And that undergraduates really respond to it well when given the time to kind of get into it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm thinking of, reckless decisions when Rosamond rides the horse and Lydgate has told her not to. And you can say, oh, she's an independent woman. She can make her own decisions. Well, maybe he has your best interest in mind, actually, when he's saying, please don't do this.
Yeah. So there are really good ethical dilemmas in the book. And that is another thing that Eliot gives us. And yeah, exactly. So Rosamond doing that. I mean, Mr. Garth, we love him, but he has also like put his family's livelihood on the line a lot. And that's a vocational decision that Mrs. Garth has had to kind of respond to. And I mean, there are time and time again that you think, I would even put Ladislaw in that camp. He's kind of reckless. He's like, I'm going to be a poet and all this artist person. And, he's obviously the sort of type that Eliot has cast, but because he's a little cavalier, Casaubon's like, well, I'm going to make sure that you're not going to be like, so he kind of punishes Dorothea and him for that. Had Ladislaw rated it in a little bit, maybe not. So you just sort of, you think about this, and I don't think it's not to sort of say you're bad, you're good, but just say these are decisions in real time. They have consequences. And that helps us really think about what does it mean to sort of come into the world, into adulthood, and be adults with adult decision making. And what kind of life do you want to have? What's a priority?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And also kind of the concept of the outsider, the other with Will Ladislaw, he's of Italian lineage. Oh my goodness, so exotic.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. The outsider. And I mean, one thing that I think that Eliot, and I write about this in my chapter in my book a lot, but it's like the what if narratives or the alternative narratives. Like you just think like, oh gosh, like the minute we meet Will, we're like, oh, we wish Dorothea wouldn't have married Casaubon. And so
yes,
what the narrative, what the novel is always doing is this alternative narrative. Like you're thinking, oh, if only this, and you have the same thing with Fred and the same thing with Legate. So you're kind of always in this alternative what if unwritten narrative role. And I think my argument would be that when we read Victorian novels, because of the multitudes of narratives, we all have a lot of these unfinished narratives. And there's a value in those for our own lives because we all always have unfinished narratives, right? We had to choose this and not this. And like to see that on the page, it's not just like a guide to life, but the tools with which we bring like, the study of literature, like close reading, attention to form, sort of engaging with history and historical narratives and personal narratives. All of that is very helpful for us as people. Yeah.
Oh, this just makes me want to reread Middlemarch right away. Actually, this year for my birthday, I asked my husband, I don't want a gift in a box. I want you to read Middlemarch.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
He's read the first, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, my suggestion would be like, give him long enough to, 3 months to kind of do it or whatever. But yeah.
Yes. Yeah, no, he has time. And, but he has read the first couple chapters and he's like, okay, Dorothy is annoying. And I'm like, that's how most people feel when they start.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
you're in good
absolutely.
company.
Absolutely. Okay. We got a lot of pages left for everyone to sort of evolve out. Yeah.
Yes.
And I know, annoying for sure. And I know it is the sort of thing that you wish everybody could get into. I mean, one thing I always tell students, I'm like, well, you're used to like serialized everything now. Like that is not new. Let's be clear.
So true. Yes.
And this sort of communal, let's talk about what everyone's watching or listening to is kind of, like the Victorians. I mean, like it was a lot of like in journals and things like everyone was talking about like what was in Household Words, right? Or what was in All the Year Round. Like, so that is another way to kind of think about it. Think about like the chapters of the books as reading group, just even those singular pieces, like, let's just talk about Dorothea this week, because that's what that was about. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh. So could you share a little bit more about your book that you wrote? So it's, a lot of what you've been talking about is in there, but then are there other things besides Middlemarch addressed, I'm assuming?
Yeah. So the book is called Cultivating Vocation in Literary Studies, and it's an edited collection that I worked on with my colleague Stephanie Johnson and published by Edinburgh University Press. And it's a collection of essays about how literature helps cultivate a sense of calling, or what we call vocation, maybe meaning and purpose, helps us discern purposeful work, helps us contribute to society. So, I mean, this is a large field of scholarship and, across the humanities, but also higher education. And so our book was specifically about literary studies and how when we teach students to read closely, to engage with theory, to think about narrative form, all of those things, we're actually giving them skills to think about then vocational discernment. So where to go next, how to sort of discern, we're at a point later in life, like, oh my goodness, should I go this way or this way? Like, well, we've actually cultivated a lot of skills to like think deeply, think critically, read closely, about those things. So my chapter is on narrative and the novel in particular. And I use Middlemarch as the example novel because it's often regarded as like the novel about vocation because of all of the exploration of work and also purposeful living. Like, it's just like, oh my gosh. And I mean, there's just a, famous scene after famous scene where Fred's supposed to be a clergyman and Mary's like, he's not fit to be a clergyman. And Rosamund's like, well, that's what he's been going to, university for. And Mary's like, if he's going to do that, I'm leaving because he's terrible at it. And that is so important for undergraduates to listen to and for all of us in, American society, because it's just like this idea, like you must major in this certain thing, or even if you're not fit for it. That's just such a bad way to go about life and to go about education. And so time and time again, like Lydgate's call to medicine is really a very particular thing. He wants to be a scholar of medicine, right? And be kind of an explorer of ideas. And he ends up being a small town doctor. And so it's like, okay, but you see the characters reconciling with that over and over again. And that's one thing that I talk about the sort of way in which we study narrative networks where all of the narratives cross. How does that help us discern vocation? Another thing I talk about is the unfinished narrative. Yeah, it's not finished, but that's okay. Failure is part of narrative. It's part of Middlemarch from the beginning. And that's important to think about. So that's the chapter in this book. I have another book that I've edited, another project that's coming out from Oxford in this year, and it's on vocation and the common good. So this is scholars outside of literary studies, but my chapter is on reading for the common good and how really when we read with strangers, which is anywhere in the classroom, but also maybe in, community reading groups or online reading groups, things like this, like that can really help cultivate the common good because we learn to unbecome strangers as a result of sort of these shared narratives or shared approaches to reading that can really help us sort of build dialogue and deliberation. So that's the next sort of direction of my scholarship. Yeah.
Oh, well, and I forget, in your introduction, did you mention your podcast? Because I will make sure to link to it because
the podcast is Callings, and the subtitle is Conversations on College, Career, and a Life Well Lived. And so that's the podcast. And then so I work at Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa, but I also direct the scholarly resources project for NetView, which is the Network for Vocation in Undergraduate Education. And that is a consortium of 300, a network of 300 colleges and universities across the country that really are interested in bringing vocational discernment and education and opportunities to students. So that, throughout their education, they're sort of understanding who they're called to be in all of the parts of their lives and how we can kind of contribute to the world through that work.
Very nice to hear about. And thank you so much, Erin, for taking the time to speak with me. And I am really looking forward to hearing what everybody thinks of this talk.
Thanks, Kate, for having me. What a great, great resource you've created.
Oh, thank you. And have a great day, everyone.